All right. We will have the chat enabled shortly. And with that, let me hand it over to our CEO, Ms. Jina Krause-Vilmar.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining. We're super excited about this conversation. And I know it's only been 3 or 4 months into the new administration, but I think, we have seen already the impacts on the nonprofit sector, the 10 executive orders that are already out impacting immigrants, but also impacts on the Department of Labor and education. And so this is a very vibrant, shifting, unprecedented times. And we wanted to bring together 2 incredibly intelligent, smart women who have themselves have navigated and are navigating these times to talk through what they're learning and what we can learn from them. We've, of course, at Upwardly Global, and honestly, all of us have experienced these shifts firsthand. And we have experienced shifts in the past, whether it was COVID, whether it was under the first administration, or whether it was under the Biden administration with the evacuation of Kabul in Afghanistan or the war in Ukraine. And we know that, there's a need to localize our work. There's a need to invest in reskilling and upskilling of populations. And there's a need for deeper and bigger partnerships in these moments. That said, it can always be difficult to stay true and grounded to mission. And so we really want to emphasize and ground ourselves in that conversation. I'm going to introduce our 2 speakers. So Nikki Cicerani, who is dear to our hearts at Upwardly Global. She's currently senior partner at SYPartners. But more importantly, she is the former president and CEO of Upwardly Global. Nikki was held that role from 2009 to 2018. And faced a lot of significant periods of growth and change in the organization in that history. So we're thrilled to have Nikki on board. And joining Nikki is a dear friend to Upwardly Global, Monica Munn, who brings both deep experience leading organizations through times of uncertainty and working to ensure that immigrants, refugee communities are not left behind. Monica comes to us as the Chief Social Impact Officer at World Education Services. And together we're going to be exploring sort of the lessons leading through times of disruption and how we can sustain our work through mission, including times of disruption that come from technology and shifts in AI. So with that, I'm going to take a brief pause because we do want to introduce a live poll to get a sense of, for you and your organizations or where you're sitting right now, what's the biggest challenge your organization is facing? And if you just take a couple of seconds to respond. For those of you that are joining, I hope you had a chance to get out your phones and scan the QR code to respond to that question. We don't see it at the moment, but it sounds like we've got a lot of responses. Wow. So as we're talking today about uncertainty for our panelists, we see that, the biggest piece here is the policy and regulatory shifts and how we're navigating that. So thank you. So I'm going to invite my 70%. Yeah, wow. I'm going to invite our panelist speakers, Nikki and Monica, to turn on their screens and unmute themselves. And my first question to you is, Nikki, you led the organization at Upwardly Global under the first Trump administration, where I think we saw significant and huge changes in both the regulatory and policy environment. but also the shift in tone towards immigrant communities. Um, can you talk a little bit about, how you navigated that uncertainty at that time? And I think it's particularly important because we didn't know what to expect then. And in some ways, we have a little bit of a sense of what to expect under this administration, although they continue to surprise us and I think move faster than many of us expected. Um, but how did you manage that, and what lessons can you glean from that?
Yeah, thank you. And I just want to start by saying, like, we didn't do this when we were at Upwardly Global, meaning like under my leadership, we didn't do a public board, and it's just really wonderful to like see the entirety of the Upload community like come online together. Um, yeah, I don't know, just what a great idea. Love it. Love that you do this. And I would say, just to bring everybody into that moment, like, remember, nobody expected that. Like, it was a shock. Whereas I think the second Trump presidency was not a shock. The first was a real, and it came after like the Obama administration. So I was fortunate enough to be actually in Chicago the night that Obama was elected, and we were just ebullient, and we like everybody thought like new day, new day, new day, you know. And we did do a lot of work in the Obama administration, I think, to prepare for making the federal government have a bigger role in immigrant integration. So that started with Imprint, and it started with like really organizing lots of conversations throughout the country amongst workforce developers, like, don't you see skilled immigrants and refugees, and do you have a solution for them? And and I think we thought, oh, we were going to get a big boost, from a Clinton presidency, who was planning to have an Office of New Americans, and we had seeded what that would be. And I mean, literally, to watch all of that work, all of that table setting come down, but not just come down because it was a candidate that wasn't that candidate, but it came down because it was a vote for something very different in that moment that I think everybody felt blind to. Um, and so, I think your question is how do you navigate that moment? And I think the first, like, for that was to just hold people in it, and I think it was to kind of give people space to like process that shock, process that uncertainty, but not to stay in it for too long. Because I think what I remember from that time, and again, it's, it's back a long ways, is that they did start right away, right? There was the Muslim ban immediately. Um, and we were more vocal
Yeah,
probably about that than we had been on topics that did not touch skilled immigrants in the past.
yeah,
And we did start to speak out on things that we had said, we are in a new day, and we're going to have to find where our line is again. But we knew that we didn't feel like we could really be true to our mission, um, and really true to our vision. I think it was even beyond our vision, but the vision that we hold. And we knew when we felt like something was fundamentally a violation of the value that we stood for. And we spoke out in that moment in a way that we hadn't before. And I think it was mostly positive, mostly supported. But I think it was maybe the first time ever that, like, not everybody was on the same page about that act. And, maybe what leadership was about saying, like, it's worse to say nothing.
mhm,
Sometimes it's better to say and to like learn whether or not you crossed a line that you don't want to cross again. But I think I would have been far more regretful in that moment had we stayed quiet in the Muslim ban, had we stayed quiet about what we thought that signaled that we would not stay quiet about in the future. And so that was like one thing, that I do remember very specifically was like, ooh, we're going to be asked to say things. We're going to feel compelled to say things that are not directly in line with our mission. We prided ourselves so much a bit like we are really committed to like the mission we are. It's not every immigrant, it's not every refugee, it's
yeah,
not every issue for them. But this was new.
yeah. I really appreciate you sort of orienting toward the values on top of the mission.
Yeah.
Because I do think for organizations, it can be like, is this mission drift? And the reality is well, if it's grounded in the values and the communities you're representing, then maybe it's not. And it's experimentation, right? And how do you get comfortable with the risk of experimentation in a space where you don't know how your own supporters might respond? Because you did an incredible job of really bringing on Republicans in
Yeah.
this time.
Yeah, we had Trump supporting Republicans on our board at that time. We had multiple Republicans and we had some that I know supported Trump. And it was hard, I will say that. And I think it was hardest for the Trump supporting Republicans who felt like they may not be able to be vocal about why they are in support of. And in many ways, what I think we were witnessing was a little bit of the shutdown of dialogue, that started to happen, I think, inside this kind of political division that was happening. But it became even more important for me to make sure that that board member felt like we need this voice here. We need him on our board because it was like grappling with the things, which is like you can have a policy stance and still be a human that is working day in and day out for a thing that this organization believes in and a future that we want to see. And so again, like these are complex times. And I think what I noticed about is that I used to think that Upwardly Global was complex because, oh, we have a New York office and a Chicago office and a San Francisco office, and all our funders just want to fund the local thing. And like that was what complexity was. And then complexity became this whole new thing that we actually had to navigate. And that was a good example of what was complex, like wanting the voice, needing the voice, but everybody having it took a lot more hand-to-hand combat, I remember, for me as a leader, a lot more one-on-one conversations, making sure people felt included and making sure I was getting a diverse set of voices, um, and explaining the rationale for why we actually kept a very diverse board.
Yeah. Monica, you sit in philanthropy, and philanthropy is also facing a moment where it has to define its comfort with risk. Not only because of, so much federal funding has been cut and there's so many more needs that are being unmet, but also there's all these executive orders out, particularly the one that impacts Upwardly Global is the executive order on DEI, and navigating that. So, as you speak about what philanthropy can and should be doing in this moment, how are you thinking about that?
Yeah, no. Oh, well, thank you so much, Gina, for having me here and getting to be in dialogue with you and Nikki. It's really, truly a pleasure. Um, you know, Wes, just as a little context for folks who are joining us, we're a global nonprofit social enterprise focused on advancing inclusion for immigrants, refugees, and international students. And we firmly believe that everyone should be able to put their skills and education to work no matter where they are. And so we are many things, one of which is a funder. And, our work sitting at the crosshairs of immigration, workforce development, DEI, is like all the things that so many different executive orders and actions are focused on right now. And so to your, question, Gina, when I sit in rooms with fellow funders and others in the philanthropy space, the conversation almost immediately comes to risk and risk management in this moment. And I say to all of them, my first answer is like, there's no such thing as a zero risk approach right now. It doesn't matter what issue you're funding, it doesn't matter what community, what impact area you're focused on. All of our efforts, whether or not you think so or not, are under threat. And we just have to acknowledge that there's no such thing as like entirely mitigating risk in this moment. And in fact, one of the obligations, I would say, that philanthropy has coming from a place of resource and privilege is to take risks and to support the organizations and the fields and the communities that they are here because of, right? Why would philanthropy exist otherwise? And so I do think, like we saw in the first Trump administration, and that I would say is interesting because I joined West back in 2019 to launch our philanthropic arm. And so we were in the middle of the first Trump administration, right? And we saw funders, an increase in funding in that moment, after the first inauguration. And a lot focused on immigrants' rights, a lot focused on folks at the border, but a sort of call to arms amongst philanthropy. We have not seen such a public call to arms, particularly on this issue in the second administration. But I will say there's encouraging work, to like maybe provide a little like demystification of what's going on behind the scenes. I would say there's some encouraging things happening as I see other funders, perhaps that have a public health focus as their organization, actually coming in and putting a lot of money to work in immigrant and refugee issues and communities because they see the connective tissue that thriving communities, healthy communities, right, require immigrant and refugee talent to apply their skills, require immigrant and refugees to be part of our community, right? So that for me is like a positive signal. There are other ones where I see folks sitting and waiting on the sidelines, and I'm like, come on, guys, let's get on in. I will say, Wes, we have just almost doubled our grant making budget for the year to meet the moment of our partners, and also not just to think about rapid response work, but to really keep our eyes focused on the long-term game we're playing on systems change and advancing inclusion, and to think about what are we rebuilding towards, right? If things have been devastated and dismantled, how might we think about a different future we can build together? So I would say those things. The other thing I would uplift too, more broadly in the philanthropic sector, there is some growing sort of solidarity statements and commitments. Looking at, say, the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project, where almost 80 foundations have signed on saying they're going to prioritize flexibility for partners. They're going to prioritize multi-year general operating support grants. They're going to be doing other kinds of capacity strengthening efforts. So all of those things, I mean, honestly, are like good things to do no matter what's happening as a funder. But it is encouraging to see funders putting, name on paper and also actually making moves in that direction. So I saw when we did the live poll, I think there was maybe a little over 10% of folks, grappling with funding instability or funding challenges, and perhaps even more when you consider the implications of some of the policy and regulatory changes. So private philanthropy is never can never be the whole answer, but I do think even while it faces perhaps in some cases existential risks, it still needs to show up and meet the moment, because if it somehow outlasts this moment, but our partners and our communities don't, then it shouldn't be around in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, and that's so nice to hear that, we have to think long term,
Yeah.
and we have to think about this as a moment of how do we become more adaptable and resilient as part of the muscle of our organizations and through our partnerships with philanthropy, and a little less of doom and gloom of how do we survive the next year, 2, 3, because there is a long-term game. And frankly, civil society will, as long as there are human beings who want to do good, there will always be civil society. And how that organizes or looks might change, but it's an important message to hear, because I think we get so stuck in the current moment. And Nikki, that's why it's also so powerful for you to hear you say, well, we had a first iteration of this and we didn't expect it, and we'd invested so much time and effort in building something that kind of got swept away. And I will say the good news is we rebuilt all of that with the Biden administration. So, we recycled all your ideas. So don't worry about it. And I will also say for Upwardly Global, because we work so much on having untapped talent, so immigrant refugee talent hired by corporations, and we get, we have partnerships with corporate foundations. We have seen a shift in narrative, but we haven't seen a shift in commitment. And I think part of that is reality is because they know they need talent, and it also and there is a huge push for multilingual talent at this moment. Like that's sort of where the market is heading just generally. And so I think people understand that talent is talent. And for those of you who might be on this call who don't know, we specifically work with work authorized immigrants and refugees and asylees in the United States. So that's a distinction. Nikki, I want to ask you, so oftentimes when we're talking about funding, there is an instinct to want to go where the funding is. And when there's less funding around, or there's more competition for funding, because there's so many needs, it's tempting to shift the focus of the mission. How do you balance staying true to the mission with being flexible enough to honestly survive?
Yeah. Oof. It's a tough question. I think, in so many ways, it requires this like letter of the law, spirit of the law analysis of the moment, right? Almost like what we were saying before, like it's a Muslim ban. It's not about who we hire. It's like, do we speak out? I think that I think that we always need to be sort of nimble in how we move forward, and we always have. Like, I guess what I just want to say is like, history is the greatest predictor of the future, and I don't think that's changing. So you just sort of made the point, Gina, like tenacity is in it's in the bones of Upwardly Global. and it takes many shapes, like a raw tenacity to just be like, well, I'm just going to keep doing this thing until it gets done. There's tenacity with creativity, like, right, the Office of New Americans wasn't going to happen. We weren't going to get federal funding to the workforce, sort of the arm of the workforce of the government to do this work, but you found another way. Like, we knew where we were trying to go ultimately. And I guess that's the point. I think that when you know where you're trying to drive at in terms of an actual and felt experience for immigrants and employers in this country, and I think what the end state is. I just think if you can keep that as your end state, people will accept that you're going to take lots of paths to get to that end state. And is it like, oh, well, we're going to widen the population we're helping do that for, or is it we're going to actually find different methods of funding that in the short term? Or is it that, because the road is blocked, we're going to do the next most important thing to get them ready once the road gets unblocked? I think you do have to think like that. It just means the road might be a little longer or windier to where you're going, but Upwardly Global's always had really good vision. We know where we're going. We know what we're trying to drive at. And I think, when I see the moment of like, yeah, we have to be particularly tenacious and particularly creative, I think it's about just contextualizing. We might do this that we've never done before. It's because the road to the end vision is either blocked, and we think this is the best place to keep people holding and waiting and still being productive, or it's the best way to actually address, who's addressable on the road to kind of the ultimate vision. I don't know if that helps answer the
I
question,
think
Jina.
what resonates about that is I do think as organizations, sometimes we get fixated on the how and the how that
Mm-hmm.
we've designed to the solution, and that
100%.
becomes our status quo. And
Mm-hmm.
and we feel like if we change the how, that actually means we're changing something more fundamentally when we're not. Because if we look at, to your point, what's the end game? There are many places, there are many ways to get to that space creatively,
Mm-hmm.
and so I think that really resonates, and it's unleashing,
Mhm.
I think, for lots of organizations to
Mm-hmm.
give themselves permission to be able
Yeah.
to do that. Because I do think sometimes we have to give ourselves permission to say, you can reimagine and let go of this work plan and these sets of activities that you designed. And then maybe you've gotten really good at and they work, but they don't work in this new world.
Mm-hmm.
Or they won't work for very long in this new world. And so you can't keep using the BlackBerry that still is able to do the thing when you
No,
really
that's
need to make the
exactly
decision.
right. I mean, I was very dubious when people were like, we're going to take our programs online. I'm like, really? Is that going to work?
Yeah.
And I have to be honest, in that moment, I didn't know. And I was just like, but everybody was like, look, this is the future. We've got to go
Yeah.
into it, and we've got to try our best to like see if this thing works, right? And so even something that now feels like, of course, and it probably feels very small decision in light of many that have been made since then about program and direction and strategy and the how, but it was a very big how at the moment that we thought had a lot of risk to it. But it was definitely where the world was going, and we were like, hey, we've got to try to kind of go there, right? And I think there are going to be more and more of those. I think what I'm sensing from this conversation is like the rate of change in the world, even if we're not talking political environment, but we're talking like technological feasibility environment, right, is going to be different, and that rate of change is going to increase. So I think we've got to be nimble.
Monica, you've seen hard decisions being made by organizations in order to stay sustainable. Like what have you seen that you think resonates in this moment?
Yeah. For sure. I feel like it picks up on so many themes that are already coming up. I mean, I think there's like a spectrum of hard decisions, right? There's on one side, there's like the obvious ones that many organizations are facing, have already had to make around what to do with programming and services, right? Where their funding has been cut or they're now facing an adverse and hostile regulatory or policy environment. What does that mean for their staff? What does that mean for the folks that they serve? Those are, very hard choices, but also not unique to this moment, right? Folks have had to grapple with that, unfortunately, in other moments, be it during the pandemic, during recessions, right? So there is probably some muscle and perhaps some contingency plans upon which you can draw to make those decisions, right? I think some of the ones that are equally hard in some ways, and perhaps folks are now grappling with, in some cases, maybe the first time, in other cases, it's been a minute, are some of the choices that have come up in this conversation, right? Around with whom do you partner? How do you let go of like how entrenched hows about you going about your work? How do you think about how you frame and talk about your work? Who are you trying to influence? What's going to be compelling to them, right? How do you live your values in a moment like this when it feels like that's on fire? And how do you tell that story to a range of constituents, right? You've got a board you're probably trying to manage. You have staff, you have community partners, you have perhaps, depending on your organization, direct beneficiaries or program participants, right? You might have fund organizations you fund, right? Like everyone has their own unique constellation of stakeholders, but they all probably don't want exactly the same thing. And so how do you navigate that and evolve, right? And I think those are really hard choices. And I can, certainly I think about our own internal conversations at West, be it around when do we use our voice, what issues, Nikki, you talked about how that showed up for Upwardly Global during the first Trump administration, right? And I think many organizations are revisiting how they showed up last time around and what looks similar and what looks different this time around. Thinking about how do we get to those that aren't part of the cause, right? Like, how do we actually make the case in a different way that supporting immigrants and refugees isn't just about supporting immigrants and refugees. It's about building communities that are resilient. It's about building economies and a workforce that is competitive, right? Like, there's a different way you talk about that, perhaps, right? And that can be uncomfortable, but also can be what moves us forward. And so I think some of those choices, right, are really tough. And so I see in some organizations, right, then you just don't make a choice. And let's just all be clear, not making a choice is making a choice, right? And so I think about the like time and energy that goes in, some of, organizations and, that just like interrogating these questions, right? And of course you should be thoughtful about these things, but you also just need to go because there's never going to be a perfect choice. And if it is a true choice, then there are trade-offs. Because if there were no trade-offs, it's a no-brainer. You just not a choice. You're just doing the thing that's like the easy and simple thing, right? But this is going to be messy and it's going to be complicated and there's going to be trade-offs, and that's okay. And if you're not going to get it right 100% of the time, but you have to keep moving forward, right? And so I think that's one of the things that I really take out of this moment is like, how do we keep moving forward? How do we make the best decisions we can possibly make, hearing and listening, right? And I think as leaders, right, we have to be like, how are we doing that deep listening to the range of constituents who are impacted by these decisions? But at the end of the day, you got to make the decision, right? Because that's actually like in the job description. And so how do you keep that moving forward so that the work can continue, you can learn, and then, right, all of these really good suggestions y'all are talking about, which are really at the end of the day, the muscle of adaptive management, which is like vital all the time, but especially when times are hard, how do you really put that into practice? And also my cat just is like enamored of this conversation. So apologies to all if she keeps like butting her way in.
We don't hear the cat. Don't worry. I have like
Okay.
some
I
noise
just see like
outside
little
my
ears in the
window.
background. So I just know she's coming for the screen again.
Um, what really resonates with that is I do think leadership can be paralyzed by the need to feel like there has to be consensus on everything, especially big direction changes. And you cannot lead with consensus, but you can lead with transparency and buy-in and deep listening. Oh yes, there's a cat. And I think that a lot of leaders, they need to hear that because it is hard, especially in the nonprofit sector, because so many people do this work because they're so passionate and they care. I think one of the things that we've been discussing at Upwardly Global recently is how do we focus on what we're trying to accomplish and not let all of the outside world impact how we feel like we can focus on what we need to get accomplished, because you can get so distracted by all the noise, and it's real and it's in our lives, it's in our personal lives. We have many staff at Upwardly Global who are carrying all their documents with them now and have their children carrying all their documents with them because they're worried about ICE and they're illegal, but it doesn't matter anymore.
Doesn't matter.
And so that is real, but at the same time, when you come to work, we have to stay focused on what the mission is and what we're trying to accomplish and not get distracted at trying to solve for social justice in the world because then we're not being efficient with the energy that we do have.
Yeah.
Nikki, you're nodding. Do you want to say something?
Yeah, that's a conversation we've been having since the beginning of time at Upwardly Global. And I'll just repeat Jane Lou, like, it is like, every immigrant, every refugee who walks into an Upglow office or comes online is going to have a story that has hardship in it, that has difficult choice in it, that has a current situation that is somewhere between annoyingly, but also like maybe like horrifically, right, challenged and under optimized. And Jane used to always say, the best possible thing we can do for this person in this moment is help them get a job. And I think staying maniacally focused on that and on doing that thing, I think it's the difference between also attribution and contribution, right? I want to make a contribution to a world of social justice. But we can attribute my slash upwardly global's effort towards is making sure they get the economic stability they need to start to address the other things. Economic uncertainty is got to be a multiplier of other uncertainties, and so
Yeah.
yeah, Jane was always just super clear. The best possible thing we can do for anybody who walks through that door is help them get a job.
Yeah. Absolutely. That so resonates, Nikki. I mean, I just say like, yeah, Wes just went through a journey to land a new 10-year strategy. And we spoke to so many folks who have used our credential evaluation, who have participated in some of the initiatives we've supported. And our mission is to help folks thrive. And when we ask about thriving, it's about good work, right? You can't, it's really hard to thrive without a good job. And so I do think that that call for, right, well, we have so many different kinds of organizations and leaders on this call, right? But like in your own work, right? Like coming back to like at the end of the day, what is the unique thing we can contribute here? We don't have to do all the things because that's not realistic for any one organization to do, but what's that thing that can anchor us? That's our North Star, even as we adapt how we deliver it or adapt how we resource it or adapt the pace at which we can implement it, right? Because we need to be a little bit more, right? Like pace is one also sometimes something we can toggle on, even if you don't want to, which I get as a human that likes to do all the things. But that's also, like what are the variables that are in our control? And I think that's important for us to remind ourselves of in these moments where it feels like so much is out of our control, right? Like, what are the things that we have agency and control over, and how do we exercise those and reclaim them?
Monica, I want to touch something you talked about a little earlier, which was partnerships.
Mm.
Because, first of all, we are in this space where we have 1.8 million nonprofits in the United States, right? It's a lot of nonprofits. 22% of nonprofit jobs have been eliminated since the current administration because of federal funding cuts. And at the same time, as government does less, and is funding less, there are more and more needs. Like those needs don't go away. And somebody has to catch them, otherwise people fall. And so partnerships is something that, I know you were at the Welcome Interactive recently, which is a lot about that. It's something I'm fixated on is how do we start thinking about partnerships in a deeper way? And you mentioned this earlier, is we get fixated on the how sometimes. And I also think we get fixated on like our theory of change is the right theory of change. And this is the only way we're ever going to solve this situation is through our theory of change. And there is some ego in that and letting go of that in order to actually then start building some of these partnerships. Can you talk a little bit about, how do you see the role of partnerships in times of scarcity? What kind of partnerships excite you? If people are thinking about, I'm working, and I'm not talking about referrals. So I think one of the things that especially direct service organizations do well is thinking about who are the other organizations that are the legal aid providers, that are the domestic violence providers, and referring out, but actually thinking about partnerships much more in, we have an aligned values and aligned end game. And then how do we think about what that means for us to work together in a deep way? And I want to ask you about that. And also Nikki, if you want to piggyback, because I know, you created some important coalitions that didn't exist.
Yeah. Oh, I love this question so much, Gina. And it's so perfect to be in dialogue with you about it because Upwardly Global and Wes have worked together in partnership in like so many different ways over the years. And it'd be just, like tone deaf for me to be up here and say like in moments of scarcity it's trying to shift to an abundance mentality, like let's all be real about what's like that's not what's happening here, but I do think it can be a coalition mentality, right? And exactly as you said, it's not about like who can we refer to here or this, it's like really what is the work to be done, and then thinking a lot just independently as an organization, but really thinking collaboratively in a non-competitive way and in a non-proprietary, right, like a not pride of ownership way, what is our respective pieces of that pie and how do we move alongside each other on this journey? And I think one awesome example is really some of the work we've collaborated on around the barriers that folks with international education and internationally trained healthcare professionals, right? Like you all see that with your job seekers day in, day out, folks who are trained as physicians, trained in other healthcare professions who can't get access to commensurate work. And Upwardly Global has done amazing things to help break down through some of the pathway guides around licensure barriers to support folks with direct application to get back into those jobs or into alternative pathways. That's amazing, right? West doesn't need to do that. We can maybe focus our resources and energy on doing some of the state advocacy work, right? Which we also collaborate with through the Imprint Coalition, but we can put maybe more of our staff resources on that side, or we can go fund some other organizations doing different kinds of work in this space, right? And so that's where it's like, no need to replicate. Y'all got this. Let's support and amplify the work you're doing, and then we'll take on with our resources a different part of the problem. Because guess what? With systemic issues, there's lots of root causes, right? There's not like one thing to be done. If only there was only one thing to address and our problems would magically go away, right? So I think that's a really beautiful example. And we've seen such momentum. We've got now, I mean, amazing individuals who are back in jobs that they are skilled and trained and ready to do and supporting communities, providing quality healthcare. And we've got better regulatory and licensure environments in over 20 states, right? That wouldn't have been possible if we weren't doing this together. And so I think that's a really good example of what I would love to see more of, right? And that does require trust between organizations, right? That, I mean, like, I just come back to something you said, Gina. It requires taking the ego out of the equation, right? Like, I don't care who does the thing. I just want someone to do the thing. And if there's a way we can complement each other and stay connected and coordinated and move together, then like, let's do it that way. And like, I don't care whose brand goes on what, right? But I think that can be understandably, especially when you are in a dynamic and, for all of us who are in fields that donors is a thing, right? Like, where does money come from? How do you advocate for your own organization and your work? Like, that is part of the role, but also thinking through it doesn't have to be the like driving force, right? So anyways, I'm sure, Nikki, you've got lots of thoughts.
No, I'm just smiling. Honestly, my human react. I'm gonna go on video. This is a picture of me. I was getting married at City Hall in New York City, and right after I did, I ran to an Imprint meeting.
I love it. I love it.
Because I wanted to be there because it was honestly maybe one of the more fulfilling things I ever did. When working with Upwardly Global was to find that community of people who were willing to kind of suppress their own ego and their own organization's immediate needs in order to come up for like let's all wear one hat and like let's figure out if we're wearing that one hat and we're all operating from a place of like a set of values and a vision that's bigger than each of our organizations individually. How do we get it done? And we started small, as you know, right? There were like 5 or 6 orgs. I can't even remember, but the fact that people did that in that moment, it was not a moment like this. We were resource constrained at the moment because the field was resource constrained, because people weren't yet giving kind of lots of money to like skilled immigrant and refugee integration, or even immigrant and refugee integration. I'm not sure they're still like handing it out in buckets either, but I think we were still early in making people aware of the issue. And just, it was, I don't know, it was a very fulfilling thing to come together and be like, all right, each of our organizations are in service now, even of one step higher for the field. So I think what I want to say is that it almost sounds like sacrifice and sounds like work. But even after I got married, I was like, I gotta go. I want to go do this thing.
Love that.
Well, and I have to say, field building is something lots of us don't have time and attention for, nor does, not all philanthropic funders fund for field building, but it's so critical in order for us to really cross collaborate and also for us to build those spaces of trust. Because we're all so busy doing the thing, and frankly fundraising, that gets challenging. I want to invite folks to ask questions in the Q&A if you have questions. Please don't put it in the chat because the chat's very long and I won't be able to capture all of it. But I will give people a second to do that. And while I am, maybe I'll just ask one more question from both of you, which is, I know this was one of the questions and maybe it got like 20%, but how do you maintain staff morale?
That's such an important one. I saw that on the chat, on the poll around staff morale and burnout. And it's real, right? I mean, Wes, like upwardly global, so many of our colleagues are deeply personally impacted by the hostile environment to immigrants, refugees, and international students. And while we're all on this call, right, seeing what's happened at Harvard around barring international students at Harvard, right? Like this is such a dynamic moment and it is so easy to get sucked in, right, to what's happening. And so I think, one of the things we really have been trying to do with our people, and there's no one way, right, to support morale and mental health and wellness. But a couple of things we've been really talking about. I mean, one is like, how do we just lead in like a human way, right? Like, how do we start off all of our, we are holding space with our colleagues every other week to come and talk about what's happening in the political landscape. What does it mean? But we start every meeting off with like, how are we all taking care of ourselves in this moment, right? And also making sure, as much as it's very easy to lean in and focus on all of the negative and challenging things, also to hold space for bright spots, because there are bright spots, right? And I think that's one thing, right? When, particularly from a morale point of view, but also burnout, like if you only focus on all the negative things that, like, it's not that you want to bury your head in the sand like an ostrich, right? Like we have to know what's going on so we can be well equipped to do the work and to fight. But we also have to look to inspiration to bright spots. And I will say, like, that was so lovely being at Welcoming Interactive and in person, right? Like in community with folks to listen to all the amazing work that is happening across our field, right? And to be like reinvigorated by that, to be reminded, like, I may not see it day to day, but there is all these things that we're like, is someone working on that? Like, yes, someone is working on that. And it is incredible. And they should be, and we want to help them do more of it. And I'm so grateful that they're doing it, right? And so I think like where there's space to lean into that, but also just right, we talked about organizational flexibility and adaptation. Like we also have to hold that support for each other as colleagues, right? Like folks may need some time. Folks may need pace and work plans may need to change, right? To hold for like the very human element that is doing this work. And so, for any of us folks here, right, who are people leaders and thinking about how you set that tone with your team, like that's just so important, right? Like we can't just keep like, moving ahead, not assuming that that's real. And I think, where there are opportunities, right, to provide resources to staff to help them navigate this moment, like should I carry my paperwork? I have to travel across a border, for work, right? So for Wes, since we work in both the US and Canada, we've been trying to provide resources to our teams just to help them. We can't answer all the questions, of course, but just to help them understand how to de-risk some of those things or what to be aware of in just doing their jobs, right? Or to say like, if you don't want to travel, don't travel, right? Like that's fine, right? So I also think just like saying some of these things out loud to folks, because folks may make, people make assumptions. So I mean, these are three of like, there's a whole arsenal of things one can do because there's not just one approach for this, but three I'd offer up.
Nikki, do you want to share?
I will after. You have some really good questions in the Q&A. I just want to make sure a bunch came in. If you
good.
address, and then if there's time at the end, I'll mention.
So one question is, what does Upwardly Global need supporters to do in this moment? Donate, advocate in the political space, and what are the funds needed for most? So I would say one thing we didn't talk about is narrative, which I know is something that all three of us care about deeply about. And at Upwardly Global, we are focusing on a narrative that we want to resonate with people, which is we are about unlocking the collective genius of our nation. And that genius includes everyone, including immigrants, refugees, and asylees who come here and want to contribute and be part of the American story. And so for me, there's a real need to reclaim the label of immigrant. Not only is it vilified, but it's scary. And I get shockingly lots of questions about who an immigrant is, which is so weird. I'm just like, well, it's my German husband who I got married to and decided to move to America through marriage. So I do think sharing your story, like everybody has an immigrant story, share that story, reclaim it as part of your identity, I think is one thing that is just something we have to start doing and talking about in spaces with friends. As not as this is a specific community that's vulnerable that needs help, but this is me and this is you. Donations for sure. I think any organization in this space right now is looking to shore up their funding, and really to be able to have line of sight into the next couple of years. I mean, everybody's sort of looking at how do we sustain this in the next 4 years. Political space is a little harder right now, and I think some advice we were given, which is things are still not settled at the federal level, and so really finding those champions is going to take a little bit. And I think we will just need to pause and wait to see how things shuffle out, and then find those champions to see what we can do. So I took that question. Oh, have we seen changes in recruitment and placement rates? We actually have last year we served 11,000 people. This year we're on track to serve 18,000, and we continue to have a goal of serving 25. And so I would say there's still huge need, and there are lots of people who are signing up for our programs. Some of that is, of course, because so many services have ended in other places. But also we do have this relationship with partners. So community colleges, workforce development boards, and other workforce immigrant serving organizations. And because many of them have had funding cuts and including community colleges, they're really looking to our sort of toolbox and our coaching methodology to supplement services that they have lost. So we actually see more demand. And for placement rates, I think we have to see what that looks like. I think we're on track for what we had last year, but we are going through this transition of how we capture placements. It's the hardest thing for us to capture because people have to self-report. A question on what elements can we hold as anchors in such an uncertain times to navigate it as much as effectively as possible. So yeah, what are our strategic anchors? I mean, I don't know if you, Nikki or Monica, have thoughts of, what are the anchors you hold on to, and is that different from the values I think you were talking about, Nikki?
I do think it's the value. I mean, I often do think it's the values and the commitment to mission, right? And just how there's that. I would also say the other, I'm just going to speak personally. I can remember talking to a job seeker who had gotten his citizenship on the day that Trump was elected, got his US citizenship on the day Trump was elected. And I was like, how are you? And, a Muslim, from the Middle East. And I said, how are you feeling about all this? And he said, he goes, listen, I lived through Saddam Hussein. And he was like, I still think my future is here, right? And like happy to be here. And it was such a surprising, I don't know how he would feel today. I don't know if we talked today, if he'd had the same reaction. But I think a little of what anchored me were the immigrants and refugees that we worked with and their stories and frankly their resilience. Like I can't be more overwhelmed than they are. And, I think that was a little bit, I think they knew that there was somebody who was still standing for them. And I think we were inspired that there were people who were bravely moving forward, as they always have, immigrants and refugees, right? Like there's something about that story that when you get close to it, when you spend the time to get close to the specific story, not the general one, you know, you can kind of see like all the resilience and perseverance and hope and, grit and beauty in that story. I think it's very anchoring.
Monica, I'm going to ask this next question to you, which is, how do organizations engage more deeply in advocacy and policy changes, and what are the risks in doing so?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And of course it depends on like, what's your point of departure? Are you already engaged in that kind of work? I think a lot of organizations who maybe haven't engaged historically in that are really curious about that in this moment. I would say if you're getting started off, be it in our space, right, or in others, coming back to one of the earlier questions, like where might there be other coalitions, right, that are working on this that you can contribute to? I think that's both just like, you know, and a little bit, Nikki, to your point, like solidarity and community in this moment are everything. And having a group of trusted organizations or peers that you can learn from, bounce ideas off of, complement each other's work is so valuable. But also from a influence perspective, more is powerful, right? Coming together, multiple organizations who represent different parts of an issue or a community and speaking together about a shared vision or a shared agenda, like that is really powerful. And so I think there's like an effectiveness part of it. And also it's a risk mitigant too, right? Thinking through where are you with each other, right? Versus being a lone island unto yourself doing this work. That also creates potentially some making it a little bit more harder to be targeted. Because of course, anytime you step into the policy and advocacy realm, even doing it, of course, as 501(c)(3)s in nonpartisan ways, not electioneering, but you know, there is risk in this moment given a lot of attention on our issues. I think you want to do whatever calculus you need to do as an organization on what's your risk envelope, right? And I sort of like that, right? There's not like just one thing that goes into that envelope. Some things, right? Maybe you're gonna like want to make a bunch of solidarity statements as part of your advocacy because you think that's what's helpful. Okay, that might put your visibility up, right? Or maybe it's joining coalitions, or maybe it's funding organizations doing this work, or whatever it may be. Policy and advocacy work can take different forms. But I think understanding like the various risk calculus you and your organization are willing to take is really important to then sort of prioritize different efforts. But it's definitely not doing nothing. And I think if you're just getting started or you've been in it for a while, coalitions are a great place to look to. You know, and then I think really like who are you trying to influence, right? When we talk about policy, like we're talking about federal, we're talking about state, are we starting about local? So just also starting to think through what matters for the issues, the part of the issue you're working on, and who's going to be influential to them, right? Who's going to be the compelling and credible voice? Is it your organization by dint of the work you do? Or is it actually maybe others and you can support or help their efforts? Is it actually hearing directly from those impacted, right? I think that, you know, hearing the powerful, powerful stories of immigrants and refugees themselves and the huge diversity of stories and experiences they have, the contributions they make, and also receiving communities too. Hearing the incredible value that immigrants and refugees have been brought to their community, to their office, to their workforce, right? How do we get those stories in front of folks that are making decisions on policies, making decisions on regulations, making decisions on funding? Like that's really powerful too. So, you know, there's a few different ways to enter into that space, but would encourage folks that maybe aren't doing that work to think about what might make the most sense for your organization.
Awesome. I want to thank you both for joining. I've learned so much. I am so inspired by both of you, and I feel optimistic about the future and what we can achieve together. I know we have a couple of slides that we wanted to go through just because it is the 25th anniversary at Upwardly Global. That's one of the reasons we're so excited to have Nikki here and for Jane to be evoked in this conversation because it's been a long, beautiful trajectory. So we do have a campaign running. I encourage you to take a look at this link and listen to the stories of our folks, advance their messages and their stories, and or donate to the very generous question about how do we contribute to Upwardly Global. For the next slide, I would say we also have our gala, which is Brighter Futures Together. You can see Nikki again on the big screen, and we can see what beautiful outfit she'll be wearing then. But we will be celebrating our 25 years, and proudly so, of the work that we're doing, the communities we're serving, and proudly stating that we intend to continue this work into the next 25 years. So we hope that those of you who are in New York can join us for that. And with that, I would say thank you, everybody who joined and spent your time with us. And again, as Sylvia said, we'll be sending this recording in the next couple of days. And thank you to Nikki and Monica for this great conversation.
Thank you for
Thank-
inviting me. Appreciate it,
Thank
Gina.
you.
Wonderful to
We
see
will
you.
always have you back, both of you ladies.
This was fabulous. Thank you so much. Hope to see many of you in September.
Bye.
Yes, thank you. Bye.
Goodbye.